Charlie said, my name is Brent and I work there. So that's what qualifies me. So Exponent lets web developers build native apps for iOS and Android using JavaScript. So essentially, when you're building an Exponent app, you're building a React Native app. But there's one important constraint that we place, and that is that you can only write JavaScript. So with React Native, you can drop down to Objective-C or Swift or Java. You cannot do that with Exponent. So of course, when we constrain ourselves to just JavaScript, there are definitely some possibilities that we're limiting by doing that. But I think it turns out that, is there a lot of echo? Sorry. Yeah. Okay, so I think it turns out that actually constraining ourselves to JavaScript opens up a lot of possibilities for what we can do with Exponent. Some of those are, for example, improving development velocity in various ways, improving the workflow and distribution flow, and other things like that. So if you need to write native code, first of all, you have to use Xcode and Android Studio. That's, of course, if you're writing cross-platform. So you need to build your binary if you want to run the tests. You need to build your binary to give it to somebody else and push that binary through TestFlight or Google Play Beta or whatever you're using for that. You're limited in your ability to ship over-the-air updates, even if you're using React Native, because any changes to native code will require you to recompile your binary, distribute that once again through the App Store or Play Store, and then you can finally ship the updates again. So you need to know a lot about native development in order to do this. You need to know about handling provisioning profiles and certificates and key stores. You need to know how to navigate all the plist and XML files, how to do all sorts of things. And of course, you need to know how to do you need to know how that's done both on iOS and on Android. And so with Exponent, we think that you shouldn't have to know these things. And so we're trying to hide that as much as possible and just sort of take care of it for you. So here's some of those things. Lots of questions about these. It's not something that people have a very easy time with generally. Yeah, it's not the most intuitive interface. And of course, like I was saying, different on different platforms. And yeah, so that's that. So before you even begin creating a project, you have to consider like, what platform are you developing on? So not only what is your target platform, but like what are you using? If you're using Windows and you want to make a native iOS app, well, you can't, right? You just can't. So that's too bad. But with Exponent, you actually can, because you don't have to compile any of the any native binaries to do that, and that's really the only blocker for building iOS apps on Windows. So Exponent actually works on Mac and Windows and Linux, although with Linux you have to compile it from source right now, but if you're using Linux, that probably is something you're used to anyways, so I think you'll be fine. Yeah, so let's look into creating a new project. So to create a new project, you use something called XDE. What am I doing here? All right, so XDE lets you, yeah, that's playing. So basically download, install it. It's just a program that runs on your desktop. You create a new project. It initializes all the files that you need for it, sets up a tunnel so that you can connect to your project from wherever you like. So whether that's a friend on the other side of the world who wants to watch you work on your project in real time, or a client or whatever, you can immediately, once you create the app, copy and paste that link, share it with them, or send them a link to their phone or email using XDE, and they can watch your changes right away. So if you compare this with sort of the flow for how that's done right, with React Native, it's a little bit different because, first of all, when you initialize a project, you get all of the source files for iOS and Android. When you want to run the project for the first time, you obviously compile it. You can get it on your device, but if you want to share that with someone else elsewhere, now you have to go through submitting this to TestFlight or whatever, go through that whole process. And anytime you change any of the dependencies, like I was saying before, you have to go through that process again. And sharing the URL in development as well is something where Like I was saying before, we just set up the tunnel for you automatically, and it really simplifies the process. Actually, one thing here that's useful to see. So you'll notice once the project's done creating in the background there, that on the left pane, there's some logs, and that's for the React packager. And then on the right, we have some logs that are actually your device logs. So when you're viewing the device logs, typically with React Native, you would have to, first of all, you definitely have to have the device connected. So in our case, it doesn't matter if your friend, like I was saying, friend or colleague, anywhere else in the world, you can view their logs right away, help debug issues or whatever you need to do. But of course, you need to learn these commands and do all these things and keep another terminal tab open for keeping track of this and all of that. It's a small thing, but I think these are a lot of the little improvements that we can make to Exponent that will just make it a lot easier and more pleasant to build apps. Right. So this is what it looks like when you open an app. So this is just I created a project, open the app that you get when you create the project, just like that, and then I make a change to it, and as soon as I change it, it just reloads and shows the change, and yeah, there you go on the other side, that one's going. So yeah, you get live reload just like you would with React Native. Just a quick show of hands, how many people are familiar with React Native, and how many, okay, most people. How many people are not familiar with React Native? That's good. Then I think we're talking about the right stuff. Okay. So yeah, with React Native, right, you'd run React Native init, go to your project, run React Native, run iOS or run Android, do ADB reverse so that it can connect to your packager server, then it would go and all that. So anyways, it's a much more in-depth process for that. It's something that's different on both platforms. And definitely as you start trying to share your app for testing with other people, it becomes a lot more complicated. So that's one problem that we're solving with that. Another problem, like I mentioned when we were looking at the Xcode and Android Studio screenshots, customizing your app icon or notification icon or the orientation lock or a lot of other properties that you would potentially either write some native code for or include it in a plist or XML file somewhere. These are things that you can customize using just one cross-platform JSON file. It's just called, we call it exp.json or JSON, depending on your preferred pronunciation. And as you can see, it just has, you probably can't read that actually because this is pretty far away. But what it has is icon URL that just specifies a URL that this is where your icon lives at. Loading icon URL, so when you open your app, you have a splash screen. You can customize various other things related to that, like if you have a background color. Yeah, do you have a question? Yeah. Jesse?
So,
yeah.
Right now, if you specify the 2x, what is the scale? Yeah, we can build the support to when you specify them individually if you want to scale it differently. For now, it won't show up. It'll show up.
Yeah, so this is the only place where we're not automatically scaling that depending on the DPI of your device. So if you just require an image anywhere, of course, just like with React Native, it will require the correct version depending on the DPI. So that's something, we definitely look into improving. Yeah, Joy?
Yeah, so what I'm using right now is I use three images, just dev icon at 2x, dev icon at 3x.
Yeah.
So it's automatically taking the whatever this one is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can do that. Well, in this particular file, it won't take that into account. But that's something that, like Jesse was saying, we will build in the 3x, 2x support. Right now, it's just easiest thing that works is you provide the highest resolution one, and we just scale it down for you. So something like adding fonts is, so I'm just going to talk about a few things that I think are maybe that trip people up when they're going into native development and they've just done web development before. So yeah, one of these things is adding fonts. I mean, it's really not that hard, but I feel like the cumulative effect of all of these things that you have to learn and all these things that you have to do routinely, it really adds up and makes the workflow much less pleasant with native development than it could be otherwise, especially considering the two different platforms and how they do them differently. So adding fonts, I mean, there's this whole process, as you can see here. And as you've probably experienced on the web, it's pretty easy to add fonts. It's very similar with Exponent. If you want to add a font, you just put it in your project, and then you require that font. You just load it using font.load async, and yeah, there you go, right? Thank you. Yeah, so that's something where you know, these little things like that, I think there's really a cumulative effect of improving your workflow. So another example of that is like vector icons. So maybe you add icons in this usual way. Now you want to be like, okay, I need to. Every app has icons. You're probably using an icon set of some sort, unless you're quite a large company and designing your own icon set. So probably you're going to use one of these top 8 icon sets for a lot of your fonts. Yeah. You can render SVG documents. You can't render them in their exact state right now. You have to use React components that are the SVG analogs for React, but you can. Very good. We actually have an app that got featured on the Google Play Store that we built entirely in Exponent. Yeah. Okay, sorry, I just realized I haven't been repeating the questions. So you said, what has your success been for deploying to the Play Store? I said, quite good, featured, etc. Do we have tips for avoiding the red screen of death? So it seems like everyone's familiar with React Native. Do you mean like, I mean, that would only happen in development, right? So, use Flow, yeah. Then you'll get the errors in your editor rather than in the app. Yeah. Yeah, it's the same. So is this the same as like a web font is the question, if I understand it correctly? Yeah, it's the same sort of idea of like you specify a font to download, we cache the font, and then that's used in your app. Yeah, well, I mean, you could use that. I think. I don't know about the license. I'm not giving legal advice on that, but probably. Yeah, so don't take my word on that one. But technically speaking, legally speaking, I don't know. Yeah, so the vector icons library is really good, but then of course it has this whole install procedure, and anytime you update a React Native version, if some of this goes out of sync with what's required, you're going to have to maybe make some native changes. And of course, once again, the cumulative effect of this, where you have maybe 10 libraries like this installed, you update a React Native version, 5 of them break, maybe a few of them are out of date, you're going to have a bad time, and you might not upgrade for a while, and then you're going to have a worse time. So what we do with these icons is we actually provide a wrapper around this vector icons library that we think is quite good. And we just expose these directly as just to use them in your app. You just import that icon, and it's just brought in for you. So yeah, that's I think a much easier way to do that. All right, let's look at like building some feature. So we like to think of Exponent like a way for us to explain it to people and communicate kind of what we're trying to do. Is it's sort of like Rails for React Native. So you might think of like probably, is anyone not familiar with Rails? I think everyone knows what Rails is and the idea of it. So with Ruby, if you're building an application, you're going to use like just plain Ruby or Sinatra. Like you can do everything that you can do with Rails, but you just have to build a lot of it on your own. You're going to have to install a lot of libraries. You're going to have to make sure those all play nicely together, and you're going to have to come up with like a sort of architecture for how you're going to build your app and those sorts of things. So what we're doing is we're kind of providing a wide set of these libraries, wide set of APIs, and hopefully building these practices that work for people. and make it a lot easier to build apps. So let's say that you're building an app and you want to, or building a feature, you want to add video to your app. So this is again related to like native module, kind of adding those to your app. So you might Google video, and then you might find React Native video, or like there's several other video components. Maybe you spend like 20 minutes reading the different ones and reading what one might be better. So then you go ahead and decide React Native video is probably the best one. It might not be, but maybe you decide that. So you go ahead and install that. There's this usual install step. So maybe you do that, you run the project, and then you realize, oh no, this doesn't work with the React Native version that I have installed. And you know, with these libraries, like, this is just the state that React Native is in right now. You know, there's a lot of, it's a very fast-moving project, and a lot of the dependencies don't necessarily keep up with the 2 to 4 week release cycle. And so we want to bring some stability to that and sort of help solve the problem of like everyone having to go through this laborious update process and make sure that all their dependencies are up to date by sort of consolidating them into this one framework that ensures that you have what you need to build apps and sort of minimizes the friction to adding these things. Sorry, was the question? Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like sometimes a lot of the
Yeah. Sure.
work
Yeah. Yeah, you can do that with Exponent. We have a in the EXP JSON, you specify what SDK version to use of Exponent, and the SDK version maps to a React Native version. And so what you get by specifying that SDK version is that you know that all of the dependencies, you'll install Exponent SDK, and you'll specify SDK version, let's say 9, which is the current version. And now you know that all of the libraries that you're depending on there are on that same version, and they all work with the React Native version that's installed. So that's a sort of nice guarantee that you get. And if you want to roll back, you can absolutely do that, and that would not, you could still ship the app, and even through the Exponent client, if someone has a newer version of it, it's backwards compatible with old versions of React Native. So as long as you're using one of our SDK versions and not like a different fork of React Native, which we can't necessarily make any guarantees about, then it should, yeah, it would work just fine. Yeah, just, okay, yeah, so Charlie was saying, just to be clear about it, like let's say that 5 months ago I published some project with Exponent, and you had the Exponent client app, and I wanted to show it to you, and I went in to look at it, and it was published with like SDK 5. I think that's where we first started doing multiple versioning, 6 maybe. So if you went back and looked at that, it would just work on your phone. So even if we had published like a new version of the client app with SDK 10, which should be coming in the next couple of weeks, it would still work. And so any of those versions, it just loads up the React Native. We have like version binaries, or rather version code for different, all of the native dependencies. I would just load that up and work as expected. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, just the Exponent client itself works as if it were like test flight. So if I were to, I'll talk about publishing a bit more in a bit, but if I were to hit publish in the Exponent client, it would upload your app to some URL, exp host / your username / app name, and then anybody can go look at that from anywhere. So they just download the Exponent client from the App Store or the Play Store, and you tell them the URL, and they can go there. So you can publish like whatever your app name is -staging or something like that, and then anybody can just go look at it that you send the URL to. We are also, it's on the roadmap to do private publishes. Right now it's sort of security by obscurity. So don't share your URL with someone, or like go generate a random like MD5 hash or something and then make that your project name. But I mean, it's probably secure like that. But so yeah, we're definitely looking at that as well. Yeah. Yeah. So so the question was, because we have Node modules, how do we manage keeping up with the right version of, I guess, NPM and Node and that sort of thing? And what we do is we just recommend that you use the latest version of those. And we always, at least so far, that's worked really well. You just use the latest version of Node and NPM. And
Right, but I mean, we create a project today,
yeah,
come back a month from now,
yeah,
things are out of sync. So you manage
sure.
command line do your thing.
So yeah, in that case, we're not providing anything to say. So the question is, you leave your project for a month and you come back to it, or 2 months and maybe things have changed, what Node and NPM version do you use? We don't provide anything for that at the moment. We could provide some kind of like NPM or Node lock or something like that, but what you would do there is, I guess, just make a note in your project and say, I was using this version of Node or NPM. And I believe also in the NPM shrink wrap, if you use that, it will specify what version of NPM it was shrink wrapped with. I'm not mistaken, I think it does that. So, so you could do that as well. Right. So yeah, adding something like video and Exponent, this is just as simple as importing this component into your app, and you have it, and it just works. And like I said, we keep these up to date. So each SDK version that comes out, you get a new React Native version, and you get the latest version of these libraries, and it just really reduces the headache, I think, of doing these upgrades. So yeah, this is what I was talking about before, like sharing a feature. I won't go into this too much because we've discussed that a lot already. But when you're in development, you get this URL that is basically, we create a tunnel. So we use ngrok under the hood to create a tunnel that points to your local packager. And that's just exposed in the address bar in XD. And you can share that URL with anybody. They can open the app. And if you want to make it available to them after you've turned your computer off or whatever, then you just hit publish, and then it goes up there, and anyone can access it there. So that's really nice because there's absolutely no setup for that. If you compare that to something like just React Native out of the box, I mean, of course, with just pure native, this is a huge hassle. But if you even compare it to just React Native, where you could potentially get something that approximates this by building your app and being careful not to change any of your native code, and then shipping code updates through CodeShip or code push rather, or I think AppHub might still do that. And that's nice, but you do have to do, for each project that you make, you have to set up code push, and you have to do all the sort of dance associated with that. So yeah, that's just set up by default. Another thing, like let's say you built your app now, you're ready to ship it, so it's time to do like a release build and push this up to the App Store or Play Store. So this is something that definitely takes people a non-trivial amount of time to figure out for the first time. After that, it takes probably still a non-trivial amount of time, but not like, not as much as the first time. When you're doing it, you might want to even, before you publish it, make sure you push your final build to test flight, test it out there, and then push it through to the App Store. But what we provide is just a command line tool where we build the binary for you. So you, of course, never have to install Xcode or Android Studio. You just run this tool, and we spin up an instance. In the case of Android, just like a machine that has Android Studio and that does the build for you. We have some Mac Minis that will do the builds for you for iOS. We upload it for you to S3 so you can download it, and then just go ahead and drop it into whatever you do for the App Store or Play Store. And at that point, it's quite simple. So an important point there is that in the process of building it, we ask you a few questions like, do you want us to manage your provisioning profiles for you? Do you want us to manage your key store for you? And like, this is something where you can absolutely take care of that yourself if you want. And probably you would want to have a copy of that somewhere, at least as your own backup. But we are happy to take care of that for you, and we handle it for sending out push notifications on iOS, for example. We'll create the certificate and sign the push notifications. So just works. Yeah, so there you go for Play Store, same sort of thing. So naturally now the next thing is, as I mentioned, push notifications. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because setting up push notifications on iOS and Android is significantly different on both platforms. And in addition to that, you do have to, in the case of React Native, introduce a significant amount of native code for that. So one nice thing about Exponent is actually when you just create a new project, you have push notifications working in the app right away. And we are just using a simple like echo server where you send your token to that server and we send you a push notification right away. And that just looks like this. But of course, you can write your own backend, and I'm sure you would have your own backend for an app at some point. And if you do, you of course associate that token with the user, and then when you want to, when an event occurs that requires you sending a push notification, you just run that code and you can send it. So it sort of papers over any of the platform-specific differences in the APIs for push notifications, and both on the client side and on the server side. So it's pretty useful. So yeah, that's what it looks like on the client side to register. You probably can't read it. It's just sending half of that code is sending a post request. So it's not a lot of stuff. All right, so pushing an update, we talked about that a bit, but I do want to go back to that and mention how with Exponent you do get some nice guarantees that you don't get when you use React Native normally. So code push, right, it's a really great library. I would encourage you, if you use React Native and not Exponent, you should probably use code push for updating your apps over the air. That said, there is a non-trivial amount of setup associated with it, and the first time you do it, it is something that you should test extensively, because I've seen people end up in states where they deploy it and then realize, oh no, the code for updating the app isn't working. I set something up wrong, and now I have to publish a new version of the app. Or in the worst case, I've seen with, actually not with code push, but with App Hub, where someone actually published an update that broke their app in production, and it was unable to get new updates after that. So you do have to be careful in setting that up. And another thing you need to be careful about is ensuring that the JavaScript works with the published native binary that you have. If your JavaScript depends on some changes in native code that you haven't published to the App Store yet, you have to be really careful to ensure that you don't push that JavaScript, because otherwise you're going to create a lot of crashes in production if somebody actually uses your app, hopefully. Right. So I've mentioned this one a bunch, but just going back to it again, updating React Native versions is something that I'm a contributor to React Native, and I talk to a lot of people about working with React Native, and it's a real pain point that people have. Because it's not just a matter of going to your package.json, changing the version of React Native, doing npm install, and then running your project. If it was that easy, that would be great, right? So what happens is you change the React Native version, and now maybe there are some subtle changes in the internals. Maybe a library that you used sneakily depended on some internal API, or it depended on a public API that was just changed. You have to go and track down all of these libraries, make sure they're up to date, and potentially when you get halfway through updating, you could come across a library that is just not compatible yet, and you don't have the time or perhaps expertise to debug and submit a pull request for, and you could have to just roll back your update and do it again at a later date. And it leads to a lot of wasted time. So that's, I think, a really nice perk with Exponent is you just, we take care of all of that headache so that you can just change the version there, and inside of, on our website, we just publish a change log like this for each version, and all you have to do is make changes to your JavaScript code. Or potentially exp.json if we add some new fields or remove fields or rename or whatever. That said, we do validate that for you. So if we do change the name of a field, you will get a warning in XDE. It'll just say, hey, this field doesn't exist anymore. And we could probably add a recommendation. Hey, maybe you meant to write this one. So yeah, I talked a lot more than 15 minutes, I think, so I'm going to stop. So Exponent is a platform for developing high-quality applications using just JavaScript and React Native. So I think a lot of the work that Exponent does for you is just not possible when working with native code. If you had native code in your app, we wouldn't be able to do as much. And I think that because we embrace that constraint of having JavaScript, we're we're able to, for at least a large portion of the apps that are out there today, make it easier to build reliable, maintainable, easy to distribute apps more quickly. So thanks for coming out to the first community event. Adam's going to talk next, or Skevy as people like to call him, about X navigation. And yeah, thanks.